When talking about the war on drugs in Mexico, the word cartel gets thrown around a lot.
Around the cartels. To keep the cartels.
To fight the cartels.
Sinaloa, Juarez, Los Zetas, La Familia, the list of names goes on and on. But who are these organizations that have turned Mexican cities into 7 of the top 10 deadliest in the world? How did Mexico get to a point where paramilitary drug trafficking networks bring in billions of dollars in revenue, murder tens of thousands of people a year, and often operate as semi-autonomous states within the country? In this episode, we're taking apart who the cartels are and how they went from working together to killing each other. In the late 1970s, cocaine use exploded across America. The main smuggling route was straight from the jungles of Colombia into Florida, as made famous by movies like Scarface and Blow. To disrupt this traffic, in 1982, Ronald Reagan set up the South Florida Task Force, under the command of then Vice President George Bush. But for a guy who claimed to love capitalism, when it came to the drug trade, Reagan didn't seem to understand much about how business actually works. Instead of giving up their billion-dollar industry because a few shipments had been busted in the Caribbean, the Colombian cocaine producers decided to make use of Mexico's 2,000-mile land border with the US.
This is like the narco superhighway. There's actually 300 different smuggling trails right through here. There's no big wall or anything. You can just walk off into the desert with your pack full of cocaine.
There were 2 primary Mexican operators the Colombians went to. The first was Juan Garcia Abrego in Tamaulipas, head of a gang of smugglers whose roots stretched all the way back to alcohol prohibition. They switched over to the drugs trade and the Gulf Cartel was born. The other was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Gallardo became known as El Jefe del Jefes, or the boss of bosses, creating probably the single most powerful organized crime group in Mexican history, the Guadalajara Cartel. One key issue to remember here is that at this point, none of these organizations actually called themselves cartels. So you have
Policy at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, and I asked him how significant this bust was.
I think it's a little bit overhyped. I mean, it's a serious amount of drugs, but 8.4 metric tons is not a lot when you consider that Colombia alone can produce more than 2,000 metric tons per year. And some of these narco submarines and semi-submersibles can carry between 4 to 12 tons per shipment. So I'm not sure why they're creating such a fuss over this particular interdiction, except maybe that it's the first major one under new President Claudia Sheinbaum, perhaps.
Well, the Mexican Navy has said that this was their biggest ever drug bust, but interestingly, they don't specify what type of drugs these are. Why has this information not been released?
Perhaps they're not back at port yet to give that formal, press conference. But typically it would be cocaine and possibly some methamphetamine, and in the old days some heroin. But these days it's mostly cocaine.
We also mentioned the location of the bust. It was off the southwest coast of Mexico. Does this give us any clues about where these drugs could possibly have been heading?
So this is a very common trafficking corridor. So typically these boats or semi-submersibles or submarines will come from southwestern Colombia or even across the border in Ecuador, where there are lots of estuaries and hidden places to launch these vessels. And they typically go to either Central America or that southwestern coast of Mexico, where they're then picked up and brought by land and smuggled across the U.S.-Mexico border, either through tunnels or drones or trucks or any myriad ways they can move this drug across the border.
I'd also like to ask you about the use of semi-submersible boats by the smugglers. Now, how often are these types of vessels actually detected by authorities?
There are many of them that are built and used. Not that many get interdicted. The ones that do tend to be the semi-submersibles. So these are big fiberglass or carbon fiber boats that can carry, up to 8 or 12 tons even. And they typically reside 90% below the waterline. So you only see a little conning tower for air and navigation. In more recent years, cartels have developed fully submersible submarines that can dive many meters below water and are much harder to detect.